The clock starts at midnight. Richmond, California. November 8th, 1942. Richmond, California. Kaiser's Yard. Number 2. The tide in San Francisco Bay is a black moving sheet beyond the floodlights, and the whole yard feels like it's vibrating. Steel plates clanging, cranes groaning, boots running on wooden planks slick with fog. At 12:01 a.m., the stopwatch begins, not on a battlefield, but on a slipway. A foreman, helmet low, clipboard tucked under his arm, steps into the glare and looks down the line of workers gathering like shadows under arc lamps. Welders with thick gloves, fitters with chalk-marked rulers, riggers ready at the hooks. Someone mutters, half joking, half praying, 4 days. Not 4 days to win a battle. 4 days to build a ship. A Liberty ship. A cargo carrier so plain it's almost ugly, and so desperately needed that plain has become a kind of beauty. Out in the Atlantic, ships are dying faster than most Americans can imagine. Freighters and tankers burning in the dark, men in the water, the war swallowing steel and fuel and food as if the ocean itself has joined the enemy. The message that reached this coast is simple. Replace the losses faster than they can be sunk. Build fast. Sail fast. Keep the lifeline moving. Tonight, the Yard turns that message into a dare. Somewhere in Washington, the Maritime Commission wants proof that American industry can do the impossible. Somewhere else, rival shipyards want bragging rights. And here, under these lights, it's personal, because every delay has a cost measured in convoys that never reach Murmansk, in ammunition that never reaches North Africa, in rations that never reach the Pacific Islands where Marines dig into coral with their fingernails. The keel blocks are ready, but the real secret is that the ship is already waiting in pieces. Prefabricated sections staged like giant steel puzzles. Parts counted in the hundreds of thousands. All of it positioned so the cranes don't waste a single swing. A welder, young, sleeves rolled despite the cold, strikes his first arc, and the blue-white flash throws hard shadows across faces that haven't slept properly in weeks. You can hear the rhythm of wartime production in the hiss of welding rods, in the barked commands. Hook on, ease, hold. And in the way a ship takes shape not like something crafted, but like something assembled, urgently, as if the yard itself is a weapon. Above them, a supervisor climbs the platform and shouts that the clock is running. No speeches, no ceremony, just steel, sweat, and the belief that if they can launch a hull in days, maybe, just maybe, they can outrun the torpedoes. The first sparks don't just bite into steel, they bite into time and the men and women in yard number. Two work as if they can hear the Atlantic screaming in the dark. The trick everyone learns in the first hours is that you don't build SS Robert E. Peary the old way. You assemble her like a rifle on an armorer's bench, one standardized part after another, because this isn't a yacht yard and it isn't peacetime, it's a factory that happens to launch ships. The earliest Liberty ships had been riveted in places like the old yards back east, but Kaiser's people push welding hard. Fewer skilled riveters needed, fewer hours spent drilling and hammering, less dead weight in overlapping plates, and under the floodlights, the weld seams glow like stitched scars. A runner sprints from station to station with an updated schedule board, chalk squeaking as new targets replace the old ones, and you start to see how the yard thinks, not in days, but in minutes. A crane swings a prefabricated bottom section into place with a careful, slow confidence that hides the danger. One slip and the whole stunt becomes a funeral, and riggers shout short, clipped commands that cut through the metal raw. Somewhere near the slipway, a Navy liaison officer watches with his hands behind his back, jaw tight, because he's seen what happens when ships aren't there when they're needed. He's not here for pride, he's here for tonnage. By sunrise, the fog thins, revealing the skeleton of a hull that wasn't there a few hours earlier, and the workers, some seasoned ship fitters, some fresh from farms, some women recruited into jobs that would have been unthinkable before Pearl Harbor, move past each other in narrow corridors of steel like ants inside a frame that's growing around them. At midday, a supervisor calls a brief halt, not for rest, but for a safety check. Because speed means nothing if a man falls from a plate edge or a torch catches clothing. Helmets tilt up, eyes squint against arc-light glare, and for a moment you can hear the bay again, waves tapping pilings like a slow metronome that does not care about records. Then it's back to work. Bulkheads slid into position, deck plates aligned, the first hints of internal compartments forming, holds for cargo, tanks for water, spaces that will soon smell of paint, grease, and new steel. Word travels fast through the yard that this isn't a normal build, but a demonstration, a public dare. The newspapers will come, the cameras will come, and the bosses want proof they can do it again. Not just once for headlines, but in a rhythm that can feed entire convoys. A foreman leans close to a welder and shouts over the noise, "Don't make it pretty, make it strong." The welder nods, and the arc jumps again, because the ship doesn't need elegance. She needs to float, carry, and keep moving. As the first day bleeds into the second, shift whistles trade places like a relay baton, and the hull rises higher on the ways, still raw, still incomplete, but unmistakably a ship now, while somewhere far away, in waters nobody in Richmond can see, a convoy's empty slot waits to be filled. As the second day begins, the yard doesn't feel like it's continuing a project. It feels like it's feeding a machine that cannot slow down, because the schedule is no longer a plan, it's a commandment written in chalk and barked through megaphones. In the early hours, when the bay air is cold enough to sting through canvas jackets, the hull of SS Robert E. Peary sits higher and more complete on the ways. And now the work turns inward, into the guts of the ship, where speed becomes harder, because you're threading pipes through narrow corridors and running cable where a man can barely turn his shoulders. A Liberty ship is meant to be simple, standardized, replaceable. An EC2SC1 design, a cargo carrier built to a pattern so the parts can be ordered, stacked, and welded with minimal argument. And that simplicity is why this stunt is even possible. The frames and sections were prepared like a 1,000-piece kit, jigs and templates making sure a plate cut in one shop fits in another without a fight. Cranes keep swinging, but now you see smaller teams swarming, pipe fitters setting lines for steam and water, electricians pulling wire runs, carpenters fitting temporary scaffolds so men can work the upper deck without wasting steps. The engine isn't being built here from scratch. It arrives as a prepared story of steel and cast iron, and the men guiding it into place talk about it the way soldiers talk about a trusted weapon, a triple expansion steam engine, old-fashioned compared to turbines, but rugged, understood, and quick to produce. It will push Peary at a modest speed, but speed isn't her purpose. She is a carrier, a hauler of war. A boiler section is lowered with such care that the whole yard seems to hold its breath, because if it strikes wrong, you don't just dent steel, you lose hours, and hours are what you don't have. Inspectors in hard hats move through like quiet predators, checking welds, checking alignment, checking that the rush hasn't turned into sloppiness, because a failed seam at sea doesn't care about patriotic headlines. A young fitter wipes sweat and soot from his brow and keeps working as if a U-boat is watching from the shadows beyond the Golden Gate. You catch fragments of conversation about brothers in the army, about a cousin shipping out with the Navy, about a neighbor who got a telegram, because every person here knows somebody touched by the war, and that knowledge makes the noise feel personal. On the deck above, the first outlines of the superstructure begin to rise, house-like blocks of steel that will hold the bridge, the radio room, the spaces where officers will stare into fog and squall and pray the convoy holds formation. Below, in holds that still smell like scorched metal, men chalk cargo boundaries as if crates are already on the way. A woman welder, hair tucked under her cap, face shield down, lays a bead along a seam and moves on without posing, because there's no romance in it, just heat and accuracy. She isn't here to make history, she's here to make the weld hold. By afternoon, the yard is a blur of shifts changing without stopping the work, hot meals swallowed standing up, tools passed hand to hand like ammunition. The bosses know the cameras are coming, but the workers know something else. The real judge won't be a reporter, it'll be the ocean. And as night falls again, floodlights returning like artificial moons, a rumor rolls through the slipway crews that they're slightly behind on one critical fit, the kind of small delay that can grow teeth. Because in a 4-day build, a single bottleneck is a threat as sharp as any torpedo. The rumor of a bottleneck doesn't stay a rumor for long, because by the start of day 3, the supervisors can see it in the way men cluster around one stubborn section like medics around a wounded soldier, the kind of small misalignment that would be an annoyance on a normal schedule but becomes a crisis when the whole ship is being built on the edge of a stopwatch. An engineer with a grease pencil climbs onto the steel and marks a correction line, and suddenly torches flare, oxyacetylene cutting a fraction off a plate, grinders biting sparks into the air, fitters shouting, "Hold it, hold it!" as the crane operator inches the load into place with fingertips on the controls. This is where the stunt can die, not in some grand failure, but in a tiny delay that snowballs. Then the yard system shows its teeth. Another prefabricated piece is already staged, another crew is already ready, and instead of waiting, the slipway turns into a choreography of parallel work. While one team wrestles the trouble spot into submission, others are bolting and welding hatch coamings, setting winches, fitting ladders, and closing up seams that will soon be invisible under paint. The superstructure rises fast now. Bridge house, radio room, and the angular steel that makes the ship finally look like something that can command a horizon. And inside it, electricians snake cables through tight runs, while a radio technician checks fittings, as if the Atlantic is already jamming the airwaves. Outside the fence, the attention thickens. Reporters with notepads, photographers with heavy cameras, and visiting officials who smile the way men smile when they want history to cooperate. You can feel the pressure shift because now it isn't just the war watching, it's the public too, hungry for a symbol that America can outbuild the enemy. A yard boss, coat collar up, voice raw, walks the line and tells crews the same thing in different words. No heroics, no shortcuts, no mistakes. Welds are inspected with flashlights and mirrors, gauges check alignment, an inspector taps a seam and listens like a doctor listening to lungs. Below deck, fresh paint begins to spread in quick strokes, cutting the raw steel smell with the sharp bite of primer, and men move through holds that are finally recognizable. Spaces meant for crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, sacks of flour, and all the quiet cargo that keeps armies alive. On the stern, the fittings for the ship's single screw and rudder are checked again, because a Liberty ship doesn't get second chances in heavy seas. On deck, the outlines of gun platforms and mount points appear, evidence that even a merchant ship is now part of the front line, expected to fight back against aircraft and submarines. The shifts keep changing without slowing, faces swapping out like fresh troops, and if you stand there long enough you can sense the war inside the yard's rhythm. Every whistle, every shouted command, every crane swing is a refusal to accept the ocean's tally of sinkings. By late afternoon, the critical snag is conquered, plates seated, seam welded, the schedule breathing again, and the ship, still incomplete, is close enough to finished that talk turns to the next terrifying moment: launching. The ways must be prepared, the supports checked, the sliding path greased, the hull's weight calculated so she won't hesitate or twist on the run. Under the floodlights that night, a welder lays a final bead in a hard-to-reach corner and lifts his mask, eyes stinging, and you realize the countdown isn't to a headline, it's to a hull meeting water, while the whole world watches to see if America's promise can actually float. The 4th day arrives the way combat often does, without permission and without mercy. And on November 12, 1942, Richmond wakes to a yard that has barely slept, the air already thick with smoke from cutting torches, and the sour bite of fresh paint. In the grey before sunrise, SS Robert E. Peary stands on the ways, like a steel animal ready to bolt, her hull sealed, and her outlines complete enough to fool the eye into thinking she's been here all along. But the men closest to her know every inch is new, every seam still warm in the memory of their hands. Now the work becomes less about welding and more about not letting physics embarrass the entire wartime narrative. The supports under the hull are checked. The sliding path along the ways is greased until it shines. The calculations are reviewed again and again because a launch is a controlled fall, thousands of tons of ship deciding, in one committed motion, whether it wants the water. Crews move with a different kind of urgency. Less noise, more sharp gestures, because a late weld can be fixed, but a bad launch can kill. A supervisor calls out final clearances. Riggers pull away gear that would snag. Workers slap hull plates with gloved hands as if feeling for a heartbeat. Beyond the fence, the crowd grows. Officials, reporters, camera crews, shipyard families packed together under the same cold sky, faces tilted toward the slipway as if it were a stage. Somewhere in the middle of them stands a Navy man who has watched ships burn and sink and does not clap easily because he knows a launch is only the beginning. But even he can't ignore what this moment represents. A promise to replace losses, to keep the sea lanes alive, to make the enemy's arithmetic fail. Near the bow, a sponsor is brought forward for the christening, and for a brief second, ceremony tries to impose calm on the industrial frenzy, words spoken into the wind, the bottle raised, the crowd holding its breath, then glass breaks, spray flies, and the cheers come out like steam. The signal is given, the last restraints are released. For an instant, the ship does nothing at all, just sits there, immense and silent, as if considering the drop. Then the hull begins to move, slow at first, a groan traveling through the structure as wood and steel surrender to gravity. The sound is monstrous. Timbers cracking, greased ways hissing, a deep metallic rumble that you feel in your ribs more than you hear, and the crowd's cheers rise to meet it. Faster now. The hull gathers speed down the incline, and you can see men on the sidelines instinctively step back, eyes wide, because no matter how prepared you are, a moving ship is a thing you respect. The bow hits the water with a slap that becomes a thunderclap, white spray bursting outward. The stern follows, the hull rocking once, twice, and then she's afloat, riding the bay like she belongs there. Somewhere a stopwatch is stopped, and the number is announced. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, and it lands on the crowd like a punchline to a desperate joke. Not because it's normal, but because it proves what the yard has been trying to say with every spark and crane swing. On the slipway, workers who haven't looked up in days finally let themselves stare, and you can see it in their faces. Relief first, pride second, and then the hard knowledge that the war doesn't pause for celebration, because a launched hull is not yet a fighting asset, and out at sea, the next convoy is already forming. The cheers are still echoing off the cranes when the yard's mood snaps back to its true setting, work. Because floating in the bay is not the same as being ready for the North Atlantic. And as soon as SS Robert E. Peary steadies in the water, tugs nose in with churning prop wash and pull her away from the launchways like a prizefighter being guided off the ring. On deck, men with lines and hooks move fast, faces still streaked with soot because now every unfinished detail is exposed to the public gaze. The ship slides toward the fitting out berth where the real grind begins. Installing what the stopwatch didn't measure, machinery connections, cargo gear, navigation instruments, pumps, ventilation, and the 1,000 small systems that keep a hull from becoming a coffin. Welders are replaced by pipe fitters and electricians in tight compartments below, where the air is hot and smells of paint and steam, and a chief engineer from the yard's crew, clipboard damp from fog, checks off valves and fittings as if reading a litany. You hear hammers and wrenches now, not the huge clang of plates, and the noise feels more intimate, more dangerous in its own way, because a miswired circuit or a bad gasket won't announce itself until the ship is rolling in heavy seas and a pump fails at the worst possible moment. Inside the bridge space, a compass is mounted and leveled with careful hands. The wheel is fitted, the engine order telegraph, simple, mechanical, goes in like a heartbeat. On deck, cargo booms and winches are mounted, the skeletal equipment that will hoist crates and barrels in foreign ports under blackout rules. Lifeboats are swung into position, life rafts are lashed down, fire hoses are tested, and men move around the ship with a kind of urgent patience, because now the ship must be safe, not just fast. The war insists on teeth, too. Gun tubs and mount points are prepared, and someone mentions the Navy Armed Guard, the sailors assigned to merchant ships to man the guns, arriving soon with their .50 caliber machine guns and a 3-inch or 4-inch stern gun depending on the fit. A boatswain's mate from the local Navy detail, rate and insignia sharp even among the grime, walks the deck and taps a mount with his knuckles, like he's testing a promise. Nearby, reporters still linger for quotes, but the workers don't perform for them anymore. One fitter glances at a camera and turns away, muttering, "Let 'em film the ocean next." In the yard office, men in clean shirts talk about what this launch means. But down here, meaning is measured in pressure gauges, in radio checks, in the way steam lines must be lagged and secured so they don't shake loose when the engine starts working hard. Late that evening, when the light over the bay turns copper and the cranes become silhouettes, a small group of merchant mariners appears at the pier, civilian crewmen who will actually take Peary into harm's way, quiet, watchful, not smiling much. They run their hands along railings and glance into spaces still smelling of fresh paint, and one of them, older with sea in his posture, says flatly, "She'll float." Question is, will she hold together when the weather tries to tear her apart? Nobody argues because everyone here has heard the Atlantic described as an enemy all its own. And as the shipyard lights blaze again into the night, Peary sits at the berth like a newborn thrust into uniform, the record already turning into headlines. While the men who built her know the real test is coming, the moment her boilers light and her bow points toward open water where the war does not care about stopwatches. In the days after the launch, the bay becomes Peary's first proving ground, and the mood aboard her shifts from shipyard bravado to quiet professional doubt, the kind you only get from people who've seen the sea punish mistakes, because now the headlines are useless, and the ship has to answer to physics. On a cold morning with low clouds hanging over the Richmond shoreline, tugboats ease her out, lines creaking, and the civilian master, cap pulled down, eyes narrowed against glare, walks the bridge while an engineer below waits by the gauges as if listening for a hidden flaw. When the boilers are lit, the ship takes on a new smell. Hot metal, steam, oil, and the first vibrations travel through the deck plates like a warning. The engine telegraph clanks, the triple expansion engine begins its slow, heavy cycle, and the whole hull seems to wake. Not gracefully, but with a workmanlike shudder that tells you exactly what she is. Not a racer, not a luxury liner, but a freight mule built to keep the war fed. In the engine room, men lean close to valves and flanges, watching for leaks, for pressure drops, for the small betrayals that can become catastrophe at sea. A yard representative, collar open, face still grimy, stands shoulder to shoulder with the ship's engineer, and neither of them speaks much, because the first test of a rushed build is silence. If nothing goes wrong, you don't tempt fate by celebrating early. Above, on deck, a Navy armed guard detachment has begun to take possession of their stations, checking mounts and sight lines, the clack of metal on metal as they fit parts together. A petty officer runs his hand along the shield of a gun tub and mutters about how a merchant ship now carries the posture of a warship, because the enemy doesn't care what your papers say when you're silhouetted against a moonlit sea. Out in open water, the captain orders turns, hard over, then steady, watching the ship's response. The rudder answers, the hull heels slightly, and the men on deck instinctively brace as if expecting a crack, because everyone has heard the whispers about welded ships and the fear that speed might have brought weakness. On the bridge, the radio crackles with routine checks, and through the glass you can see the vast industrial shoreline sliding by, cranes, stacks, the skeletal outlines of other ships rising in other slipways, each one part of the same brutal logic. Replace what gets sunk faster than it can be sunk. As the trial continues, the ship is pushed, not to impress a reporter, but to expose her limits. Engines advanced, vibrations watched, temperatures recorded. In the holds, men listened for odd sounds, pops, groans, anything that would suggest a seam protesting. And when a sudden thump echoes through the structure, heads snap up, hands freeze, and for a heartbeat, the whole crew waits to see if the steel will confess to being hurried. The thump turns out to be a shifting piece of gear secured too loosely, and the relief is physical, a breath you can almost see in the cold air. The bosun curses the oversight and tightens it down, because in this new kind of war production, the enemy isn't just a submarine, it's the small oversight hiding behind speed. By late afternoon, as the ship eases back toward the berth, the yardmen exchange looks that aren't triumphant but satisfied, the way artillerymen look when a gun fires true. Peary has not proven she's invincible, no ship can, but she has proven she's real, and that matters more than any stopwatch. Yet even as lines are thrown and cleats take the strain, word spreads through the yard offices and down the piers that the record was never meant to stand alone. The real victory will be when this impossible becomes routine, when 4 days becomes a symbol and 40 days becomes a production rhythm, and the next hull is already waiting in sections under the lights. Peary's return from trials doesn't bring a slowdown, it brings replication, because the shipyard isn't celebrating a single ship, it's advertising a method. And in the weeks that follow the record, the slipways keep berthing grey hulls in a steady rhythm that feels less like craftsmanship and more like an assembly line aimed at the sea. In the yard offices, managers talk in numbers, man-hours, weld counts, tonnage delivered per month, and those numbers translate directly into convoys that can be formed, supplied, and protected, because the war at sea is as much a contest of arithmetic as it is of courage. In Berlin, Grand Admiral Dönitz's U-boat arm lives on one grim calculation: sink more ships than the Allies can build, sever Britain's lifeline, starve the island, and force a peace. In Washington and in shipyards like Richmond, the counter-calculation is just as cold. Outbuild the sinkings, flood the ocean with hulls, and turn every torpedo into an expensive act of futility. You can feel this logic on the docks where Liberty ships load, crates of ammunition stenciled with destinations, drums of aviation fuel, trucks dismantled into crates, food stacked high, even locomotives shipped in pieces, because every cargo ship is a moving artery, and when an artery is cut, you don't mourn it in wartime, you replace it. Merchant mariners talk about the Liberty ships with the weary affection sailors reserve for workboats. Not glamorous, not fast, sometimes rough in heavy seas, but dependable enough to cross oceans with a war's weight in their holds. Some joke that they're ugly ducklings, others call them tin cans, but the tone changes when the conversation turns to survival, because these ships are why armies eat and aircraft fly. And the Peary record, 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, becomes a story told in canteens and newspapers, not because it was typical, but because it symbolizes a mindset, that time itself can be manufactured, compressed, forced to obey. In shipyard cafeterias, workers read about sinkings in the Atlantic, ships torpedoed at night, lifeboats drifting, survivors pulled from freezing water, and then they go back to their stations and weld faster, because the headlines are not abstract. The war's brutality reaches them in telegrams and in the faces of men leaving the yard to enlist. At the same time, the system is learning. Early Liberty ships faced issues. Some structural problems in certain conditions, quality control challenges in the rush, the need for better procedures and improved steel practices, and that learning doesn't slow production so much as refine it, because mass production in war isn't mindless repetition, it's relentless iteration under pressure. A superintendent walks a slipway and points out changes, reinforcements here, improved checks there, making sure the desire to beat the clock never outruns the need to keep a ship alive in a storm. And out at sea, Escort commanders begin to sense the shift because convoy lists grow longer and replacements arrive faster than before, turning sinkings into setbacks instead of strategy. The Liberty Ship program, spread across yards from California to the Gulf Coast and beyond, becomes its own front line, an industrial battlefield where the weapons are cranes and welding torches and the casualties are measured in delayed deliveries instead of bullets. Yet the stakes remain human. Every ship built is a crew that will sail into danger, and every ship launched is a silent bargain between the home front and the men who stand watch at night, listening for the sound that means a torpedo is running. And as the myth of the 4-day ship spreads, it carries a second, quieter truth. Peary's build was a carefully staged sprint meant to prove capability, but the real war-winning power is what happens when the sprint becomes a marathon, and the shipyards refuse to tire. If you want to understand why the Peary story mattered, you have to leave Richmond's floodlights and step into the Atlantic's darkness, because that is where the record gets tested, not by a stopwatch, but by weather, submarines, and distance. Imagine a convoy assembling off the American coast, ships lined up in columns under blackout discipline, portholes dark, deck lights forbidden, the sea an oil-black plain where even a cigarette ember is a betrayal. On one freighter's bridge, an officer grips binoculars and scans for the thin white line of a wake that doesn't belong, while below, cargo sits stacked like a promise. Tanks, food, ammunition, aviation parts, everything that will keep Allied offensives alive. Somewhere in that convoy's roster are Liberty ships, some built in weeks, some built faster, all of them born from the same brutal logic that Peary made famous. We will not run out of hulls. The men sailing them know the numbers, but what they feel is different. The long heave of the ship in winter swells, the hard slap of spray freezing on railings, the constant grind of machinery, and the tension of standing lookout at 2 a.m. When the ocean is so dark you can't tell sky from water. The U-boat threat is not a rumor here, it's a discipline. The convoy zigzags on order, escorts sweep the perimeter, sonar pings and fades, depth charges sometimes bloom into distant, muffled thumps. And when a ship is hit, you don't always see it at first. Sometimes it's just a flash and a dull boom, then a low roar as fuel ignites, then the terrible sight of a silhouette breaking apart, men running on a deck that is no longer stable ground. In those moments, the Liberty ship's existence becomes more than production statistics. It becomes the reason the convoy can keep going even after it loses a hull, because the war's supply chain is not one ship, but a river of ships. In port cities across the world, dockworkers unload Liberty ships under sirens and fog, cranes swinging crates of war to waiting trains. In Britain, the tonnage keeps the population fed and the factories running. In North Africa and later in Italy and France, it keeps armies fueled and armed. In the Soviet Union, it helps keep a front alive that bleeds at a scale most Americans can't comprehend. The Peary record becomes a talisman in these logistics rooms, a shorthand for American output. If they sink it, we'll replace it. And gradually, the sea war's tide begins to shift, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the way strategy collapses when it cannot keep up with production. Escorts improve, air cover extends, code breaking and radar tighten the net, but underlying it all is that the Allies' shipbuilding capacity grows into something the U-boat arm cannot mathematically defeat. Yet the human cost remains, and even the men in Richmond would recognize it in a heartbeat. Merchant crews lost, ships broken, the ocean taking what it wants. That's the hard truth the headlines don't print. Every Liberty ship launched sends a crew into danger, and every replacement is also another roll of the dice against winter storms and hidden submarines. But when the war planners look at the big map and see supplies flowing across oceans despite sinkings, they understand why the 4-day stunt mattered. It didn't win the war by itself, but it proved the United States could compress time, could turn steel into ships on demand, and could make the enemy's greatest weapon, attrition, fail. And back in Richmond, even as new hulls slide down the ways, the workers hear in distant casualty lists what the sea thinks of their effort. And they keep building anyway, because the Atlantic will not be persuaded by speeches, only by ships that keep coming. By the time the war's momentum turns decisively against the U-boat campaign, the Peary record has become less a stunt and more a symbol etched into American memory, proof that the home front could fight with cranes and welding arcs the way soldiers fought with rifles. And in Richmond, the people who work those shifts remember it not as a fairy tale, but as exhaustion made visible, a blur of smoke and steel where every hour felt borrowed from the ocean. In later years, you'll hear the number repeated. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. As if it were a magic spell, but inside the yard, the truth was always more complex. It was prefabrication, standardization, welding, disciplined scheduling, and an army of workers coordinated like a combat unit. It was also rivalry and publicity, a carefully orchestrated sprint designed to demonstrate capability, not the normal tempo of shipbuilding, because normal in wartime still meant weeks, and even that was revolutionary compared to pre-war practice. Yet the impact was real because the demonstration landed at the exact moment the Allies needed confidence and the enemy needed doubt. It told Britain and the Soviet Union and every Allied quartermaster that America was not merely promising supplies. It was building the means to deliver them relentlessly in a volume that would reshape the arithmetic of the sea. The Liberty ship itself remained what it was intended to be: simple, sturdy enough, sometimes rough, never elegant, and absolutely essential. The kind of vessel that doesn't win medals, but wins wars by carrying them on its deck. After 1945, many Liberty ships would live long second lives, hauling cargo in peacetime, converted for new roles, sold, scrapped, or repurposed, their wartime urgency fading into ordinary commerce. But the deeper legacy was the method, the industrial doctrine that a nation could mobilize production at a scale that made losses survivable, and that speed, when paired with a system, could become a strategic weapon. If you stand at the edge of that Richmond slipway in your imagination and listen, you can still hear it. The crackle of welding rods like distant gunfire, the groan of cranes as steady as artillery, the shouted commands that sound like a shipboard drill. Because in 1942, the United States learned to fight the Battle of the Atlantic, not only with destroyers and depth charges, but with schedules, templates, and steel sections staged under floodlights. And in that sense, the story of SS Robert E. Peary is not just a story about one ship built fast. It's a story about a nation deciding that time itself was a resource, and then manufacturing more of it, 4 days at a time, until the enemy ran out of torpedoes, out of targets, and out of hope that the sea could starve an industrial superpower into surrender.